The call came at 4 a.m. Arctic warfare training. Wheels up in 6 hours. Equipment draw in 30 minutes. SEAL Team 5 rushed to the quartermaster's cage at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, expecting the usual delays. But this time, every piece of gear was pre-staged, pre-tested, and tagged with handwritten notes. Tested to -50. Approved. Stay alive. They didn't understand why until day 2, when the temperature dropped to -46 degrees. The other team started losing fingers to frostbite, and they realized the annoying quartermaster had just saved their lives without them even knowing. Before we reveal why this man tested, every piece of gear like his life depended on it. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us which country and city you're watching from. The platoon had been complaining about Petty Officer First Class Ethan Reeves for 3 months straight. Every gear request came back with red ink. Every requisition form returned with additional testing requirements. Every piece of cold weather equipment sent back to manufacturers with detailed failure reports that read like engineering dissertations. The operators of SEAL Team 5 called him the wall behind his back, not out of respect, but because nothing ever got through him. Lieutenant Marcus Chen had drafted 2 formal complaints about procurement delays. Senior Chief Rodriguez had tried going around him through supply chain command. The junior operators had started ordering personal gear online just to avoid dealing with him. Nothing worked. Reeves controlled the equipment cage, and Reeves had standards that seemed designed to make their lives miserable. The quartermaster never explained himself. He showed up at 5:30 a.m. every morning, left at 8 p.m. every night, and spent the hours in between running equipment through tests that weren't in any manual. Cold chambers set to -60. Pressure tests simulating altitude. Repeated freeze-thaw cycles that went 30 iterations deep. Moisture barrier integrity checks under compression. Zipper function at temperature extremes. Seam strength after thermal shock. He had commandeered an entire warehouse bay and filled it with testing equipment, purchased with his own money, industrial freezers that cost thousands, thermal imaging cameras, humidity chambers, and stress testing machines that looked like medieval torture devices, designed specifically for gloves and boots. The base commander had asked him twice to justify the expense. Reeves had simply handed over a 3-inch binder of test results, showing equipment failures that would have killed operators in the field, complete with photographs of delaminated gloves, compressed boot insulation, and sleeping bags that lost 40% of their loft after field use. The commander had flipped through 10 pages, closed the binder, and walked away. He never asked again. Some questions didn't need answering when the evidence spoke for itself. What nobody at Coronado knew was that Petty Officer Reeves had been someone else 8 years ago. He'd been Petty Officer First Class Ethan Reeves of SEAL Team 2, Arctic warfare specialist with 6 deployments to Norway, Finland, and northern Alaska under his belt. He'd been the point man on cold weather reconnaissance missions that lasted weeks in sub-zero, conditions where one mistake meant death. He'd been the operator who could navigate by stars when GPS failed, who could start a fire with ice and determination, who could keep a team alive at -60 degrees when all the manuals said survival was impossible. He'd been the man that instructors at the Arctic warfare school pointed to when they talked about what a cold weather operator should look like. His name had been spoken with respect in every SEAL team that trained for cold environments. He'd also been the only survivor when his entire team died in the mountains of northern Norway during a training exercise in February 2017. Equipment failure. Simple, catastrophic, preventable equipment failure. Gloves that were rated to -40 but whose adhesive delaminated at -30. Boots that had passed every military specification test, but whose insulation compressed under extended field use until they were useless. Sleeping bags that met requirements in a laboratory but failed catastrophically in wind chill. Communication equipment that worked perfectly at sea level but whose batteries died in the cold, despite being rated for Arctic conditions. 7 men dead in 12 hours. Reeves had survived only because he'd been carrying experimental gear from a private manufacturer, gear that hadn't been approved yet, gear that he'd been testing on his own time during previous deployments, gear that he'd brought along despite regulations, because something in his gut told him the issued equipment wasn't good enough. The Navy investigation had cleared him of any wrongdoing. The official report blamed the manufacturers, updated the military specifications, issued new contracts with stricter requirements, and moved on to the next crisis. But Reeves hadn't moved on. He'd transferred to supply, specifically requested the quartermaster position, and had spent the last 8 years making sure that what happened to SEAL Team 2 never happened to anyone else. Every rejected requisition was a life saved in advance. Every delayed approval was a death prevented before it could happen. Every piece of equipment that sat in his testing bay for weeks was another operator who would come home with all their fingers intact. The operators thought he was paranoid, obsessive, a bureaucrat who cared more about paperwork than mission readiness. He knew he was the only thing standing between them and a repeat of Norway, and he was willing to be hated if that's what it took. The complaints had reached a peak in January. Chen had gone to the commanding officer with a formal request to have Reeves removed from the quartermaster position. The delays were affecting training readiness. He'd argued in a 3-page memorandum that detailed every rejected requisition and every missed training window. The platoon couldn't maintain proficiency if they were constantly waiting for equipment, approvals that took weeks longer than any other SEAL team. Other teams were getting gear faster through standard channels. Why did Team 5 have to suffer because one petty officer had trust issues with manufacturers? The CO had listened, had reviewed the request, had even pulled Reeves's service record to see if there was justification for the extreme caution. He'd filed it away with a note that said pending review, and had scheduled a meeting with the supply officer for March. Chen had thought he was winning. He'd been planning to escalate to the Naval Special Warfare Group, commander if necessary. Then the Arctic training mission had come through, and everything had changed in ways Chen couldn't have predicted. The mission was routine by SEAL. Standards 72 hours in the mountains of northern Alaska. February conditions, live cold weather survival protocols with full equipment load. 2 SEAL platoons, 1 from Team 5 and 1 from Team 7, competing to see who could complete the navigation course and establish a forward operating position first. It was the kind of exercise that built reputations, the kind that young operators used to prove themselves to senior leadership, the kind that commanding officers watched closely because it revealed who could handle the worst environments Earth had to offer. Lieutenant Chen had been talking about it for weeks. His platoon was going to dominate. They were going to show Team 7 what real cold weather operators looked like. They were going to prove that Team 5 was still the premier Arctic warfare unit in naval special warfare, continuing a tradition that went back decades. The gear draw had been scheduled for 4:30 a.m. on February 14th, but when Chen and his men arrived at the quartermaster's cage, Reeves was already there with everything laid out. Not just laid out randomly organized with military precision, color-coded by operator, tagged with names. Every piece of equipment matched to a specific operator based on body measurements, hand size, boot width, and personal gear preferences that Reeves had documented over months of watching them train. Parkers rated 2-60, tested in the chamber for 72 continuous hours under simulated wind conditions. Gloves with redundant insulation layers, each one personally verified under repeated freeze-thaw cycles until Reeves was satisfied they wouldn't fail. Boots with custom moisture barriers that Reeves had installed himself after the manufacturer's version failed his testing at -42 degrees. Sleeping bags that had been through 20 compression cycles and still maintained 95% of their original loft. Navigation equipment with backup batteries that had been cold-soaked to -60 and verified to maintain charge. Emergency rations that had been tested for palatability at temperature extremes because Reeves knew that operators wouldn't eat food they couldn't stand. And not eating in the cold was how you died slowly. Everything tagged, everything documented, everything approved with Reeves's signature. Chen had been surprised. Rodriguez had been openly suspicious. They'd never seen Reeves move this fast. Never seen him approve gear without at least one round of additional testing and manufacturer correspondence. The younger operators had joked that maybe the old man was finally learning to trust the system, that maybe he'd realized his standards were too high. But then someone had noticed that every tag had a date on it, and every date was from the last 3 months. Reeves hadn't just approved their gear quickly for this mission. He'd been testing it for 3 months, running it through protocols that went beyond anything the military required, preparing for this specific mission since the moment it had been announced back in November. While Chen had been drafting complaints about delays and filing paperwork to have him removed, Reeves had been working 18-hour days to make sure that when the platoon went into the cold, every single piece of equipment they carried would bring them home. Alive, the petty officer had simply handed over the equipment roster and said 3 words that seemed mundane at the time. Don't lose anything. That was it. No lecture about proper cold weather protocols. No additional requirements or last-minute testing. No detailed briefing on how to use the gear or what temperatures it was rated for. Just those 3 words, delivered in a flat tone that suggested he'd said everything that needed to be said. Then Reeves had gone back to his office and closed the door, leaving the operators to load their gear onto the transport truck. The platoon had checked their personal weapons, verified their ammunition loads, and headed for the airfield without looking back. None of them had looked back at the warehouse where Reeves was already unpacking the next shipment of equipment for testing, already running the next batch of gloves through freeze-thaw cycles. None of them had noticed the old photograph on his desk, 7 men in cold weather gear, standing in snow with mountains behind them, smiling because they had no idea that in 3 weeks they'd all be dead except for the one taking the picture. The C-17 flight to Alaskan, Air Force Base near Fairbanks, took 4 hours. The massive transport climbing to altitude and crossing the Canadian wilderness before descending into Alaska. By the time they landed at 11 a.m. Alaska time, the temperature on the ground was already -28 degrees. The briefing officer from the Army's Northern Warfare Training Center informed them that a cold front was moving in from the Arctic Ocean. Temperatures expected to drop to -45 by midnight, possibly -50 with wind chill by dawn on day 2. The exercise would continue as planned unless conditions became life-threatening. Cold weather was the entire point. Real operations didn't get called off because the thermometer dropped. Real enemies didn't take snow days. Both platoons loaded into CH-47 Chinook helicopters and flew north into the Brooks Range, where they would be dropped 15 miles apart and required to navigate to a designated rally point using only map and compass. No GPS, no electronic navigation aids. First team to arrive and establish a defensive position, one, simple in concept, brutal in execution. Exactly what SEAL training was supposed to be. Team 5 hit the ground at 2:30 p.m., boots crunching into snow that was 3 feet deep and powdery. Within the first hour, they understood why Reeves had been so selective about their gear. The wind was already picking up, gusting to 30 miles per hour and driving the wind chill down to -40. Every piece of exposed skin felt like it was being cut with razors made of ice, but the gear was holding perfectly. The parkas blocked the wind completely, not a single cold spot where insulation was thin. The gloves maintained dexterity, even as their hands worked to unfold maps and set up navigation equipment. The boots kept their feet warm despite constant movement through snow that was waist-deep in places and required high-stepping that burned calories and generated sweat. Chun's platoon was moving fast, staying spread out in proper tactical formation, making good time toward the rally point 23 miles to the north. This was what they'd trained for. This was what they were built for. This was SEAL Team 5 operating in their element. Team 7 was not having the same experience, and Rodriguez knew it within 2 hours of hitting the ground. He monitored the tactical frequency while his platoon moved through the mountains, listening to the radio traffic that painted a picture of growing problems. The calls were professional. Team 7 was too well trained to panic on the radio. But there was an edge to them that came from stress, from cold, from things not going according to plan. Operators were reporting gear issues, gloves that were losing insulation after just 2 hours of use, boots that weren't holding heat the way they should. One man had already developed superficial frostbite on 3 fingers and had to buddy up with another operator for warmth. They were slowing down, bunching up closer than tactical doctrine called for, making the kind of mistakes that cold weather operators weren't supposed to make. Rodriguez mentioned it to Chen during a scheduled halt at 7:30 p.m. When Team 5 stopped to verify their position and adjust their route. Team 7 had ordered their equipment through standard Navy supply channels, approved gear, manufacturer specifications, delivery within 2 weeks. They'd been proud of how efficiently they'd gotten their equipment, had made jokes in the team room about Team 5 waiting around for their paranoid quartermaster to finish his unnecessary testing. Now they were paying the price for that efficiency. Every piece of equipment that Team 7 had carried into the mountains had been issued straight from the manufacturer based on specification sheets and military contracts that looked impressive on paper. None of it had been through Reeves's testing protocol. None of it had been verified under real-world conditions that went beyond laboratory testing. And all of it was failing at exactly the temperature where Reeves's brutal testing had shown it. Would fail. The temperature hit -43 at 10 p.m. and Team 5 stopped for their scheduled rest period. They broke out their sleeping bags in a sheltered position behind a ridgeline and discovered that they were still warm, even after 8 hours of continuous movement in brutal conditions. The sleeping bags held their loft perfectly. The parkas retained heat even when soaked with sweat from exertion. The gloves dried out near body heat and maintained their insulating function. They ate their emergency rations, which Reeves had personally tested to make sure they wouldn't freeze solid and break teeth, and drank water from bottles with custom insulation sleeves that kept liquids from freezing. Every piece of gear was performing exactly as designed, exactly as tested, exactly as promised by the handwritten tags that said tested to -50. Stay alive. Team 7 called for emergency extraction at 10:47 p.m. 2 operators with serious frostbite requiring immediate medical attention, 1 with early-stage hypothermia, and the rest of the platoon showing early signs of cold injury. The exercise was terminated by the range safety officer. Helicopters were dispatched from Alaskan, but couldn't fly in the deteriorating weather conditions. Wind gusts were now hitting 45 miles per hour. A ground rescue team was assembled with Arctic-rated vehicles. Team 5 was ordered to maintain their current position and stand by as backup. Rescue element if the primary team couldn't reach Team 7. The mission had gone from friendly competition to life-threatening. Emergency in less than 8 hours, and the reason was brutally, undeniably simple. One team had gear tested by a paranoid quartermaster who'd spent 3 months finding every possible failure point, and one team had gear approved by Navy procurement officers who trusted manufacturer promises. Chen stood in the dark at -45 degrees, watching his operators stay warm and functional in conditions that were systematically destroying Team 7, and felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the Alaska winter. For 3 months he'd been trying to get Reeves fired. For 3 months he'd been complaining about delays and bureaucracy and unnecessary testing requirements. For 3 months he'd been treating the man like an obstacle to mission readiness, instead of an asset that was literally keeping them alive. And the entire time, while Chen had been filing complaints and going around him through the chain of command, Reeves had been saving his life and the lives of every man in his platoon. The ground rescue team reached Team 7 at 2:15 a.m. on February 16th. By the time they got everyone loaded into heated shelters and started treating the cold injuries, 3 operators needed emergency medical evacuation to Fairbanks Regional Hospital. The rest would recover after warming protocols, but 2 of them would lose partial function in their fingers. Permanent cold injury, career-affecting injuries that would limit their ability to operate in cold environments. All because someone in the procurement chain had trusted a manufacturer's specification sheet instead of doing the actual field testing that would have revealed the failures. The debrief happened at 9 a.m. on February 16th in a conference room at Alaskan Air Force Base that still smelled like coffee and frustration. The Team 7 platoon chief was there with his hands bandaged, looking like he wanted to put someone through a wall, but knowing there was no one to be angry at except the procurement system itself. The Arctic Survival School instructors were there with printouts of equipment specifications, trying to figure out what had gone wrong and how military-approved gear could fail so. The base commander was there because 3 SEALs in the hospital meant mountains of paperwork, formal investigations, and phone calls to Naval Special Warfare Group 1 in Virginia Beach. And Lieutenant Chen was there, staring at his equipment roster, trying to understand why his gear had worked perfectly while gear from the exact same manufacturers had failed Team 7. The answer came when they compared requisition forms side by side. Team 7 had ordered equipment in December, received it in mid-January, and deployed with it in February. 2 months from order to field deployment. Standard procurement timeline that every team in naval special warfare used. Team 5 had ordered equipment in November, received initial shipments in December, sent most of it back for additional testing in January, and finally got approval in early February after Reeves had finished his testing protocols. 3 months from order to field deployment. Reeves's timeline that everyone complained about. Every piece of equipment that Team 5 had carried into the mountains had been through. Reeves's personal testing protocol that went beyond military specifications. Every piece that Team 7 had carried had been issued based on manufacturer promises and contract compliance. The gloves told the story most clearly. Identical model number, identical contract batch, identical delivery timeline from the same manufacturer, except that Reeves had rejected the first shipment after his freeze-thaw. Testing showed adhesive delamination at -37 degrees. He'd sent them back with a 6-page report documenting the failure, demanded a manufacturer investigation, required them to redesign the entire bonding process, and had only approved them after the second shipment passed 30 consecutive freeze-thaw cycles without any sign of failure. Team 7 had received gloves from the first shipment, because they'd ordered through standard channels that didn't include additional testing. Team 5 had received gloves from the second shipment because Reeves had forced the manufacturer to fix the problem. The difference was 7 weeks of delays that Chen had complained about in writing, and the difference had saved his operator's fingers from frostbite. The boots told the same story, and so did the sleeping bags, and so did every other piece of equipment. Reeves had found defects through testing that went beyond what military specifications required. Team 7 had gear that met requirements on paper but failed in reality. The difference between success and disaster, between mission completion and medical evacuation, between healthy operators and permanent injury, had been one quartermaster who nobody trusted and everybody complained about. Chen sat in that conference room, surrounded by officers trying to assign blame and write reports, and he understood something that would change how he thought about leadership for the rest of his career. Being right and being popular were not the same thing. Being effective and being liked were not the same thing. Sometimes the person who made your life difficult was the person who was keeping you alive. Reeves had been right about everything. Every complaint Chen had filed, every bypass Rodriguez had attempted, every joke the junior operators had made about the paranoid. Quartermaster, all of it had been wrong. The platoon flew back to Coronado on February 18th, landing at 4 p.m. Pacific time. Chen went straight to the quartermaster's cage, still wearing his cold weather gear, still carrying the equipment that Reeves had approved. The petty officer was at his desk, working through a stack of requisition forms, marking them up with red ink like he always did. He looked up when Chen walked in, and there was no satisfaction in his expression. No, I told you so. No acknowledgement that he'd been vindicated. Just waiting. Chen didn't have a speech prepared. Standing there in front of Reeves's desk, with the man's frostbite scars visible where his sleeves were rolled up, the only words that came were simple. Thank you. Reeves nodded once. No explanation, no lecture, no breakdown of testing protocols. Just a nod and the silent understanding that some lessons didn't need words. Chen left the equipment on the counter and walked away. And for the first time in 3 months, he understood what the red ink meant. But Chen didn't know about Norway yet. That story came 6 weeks later, on a Thursday evening at 8:30 p.m., when he found Reeves at his desk after hours. This time, Chen didn't leave. He pulled up a chair and asked the question eating at him since Alaska. What happened to your team? Reeves was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled up his sleeves all the way, revealing scars from wrists to elbows. And he told the story. 7 men, Norway, February 2017. SEAL Team 2, Arctic reconnaissance training. Temperature dropped to -52. Equipment failed. gloves, boots, sleeping bags, communications. By day 3 they were in survival mode. The storm hit day 4. Wind chill at -70. Reeves gave his experimental gloves to his swim buddy. By day 5, 6 men were dead. Reeves barely alive, arms frozen solid because he'd given away his protection. 18 months of rehabilitation. Multiple surgeries. He kept his arms but lost his career as an operator. Medical board offered retirement. Reeves refused. He demanded the quartermaster position. Demanded authority to prevent Norway from happening. Again, 8 years of being the wall between operators and that fate. Chen left understanding that sometimes being a hero means being hated by the people you're saving. The story spread through Team 5 quietly. The red ink wasn't bureaucracy, it was blood that hadn't been spilled. The delays weren't paranoia, they were lives saved. The testing wasn't obsession, it was the difference between coming home and coming home in a coffin. Senior Chief Rodriguez said it best when a new operator complained. He's not trying to slow you down. He's trying to bring you home, and somewhere in a warehouse at Coronado. A quartermaster with frostbite scars was testing gloves for the 97th time, making sure Norway stayed in the past where it belonged.